Okay, this is genocide part 4. Um, Genocide also varies directly with relational distance. This refers to the extent to which people participate in others' lives. Okay, so again, you've got these very sociological terms, relational distance, but all we mean by that is if you're someone who's spends a lot of your day or who's frequently interacting and dealing with someone or people from another cultural or ethnic group, the idea is that participation creates links. It creates connections that overall you tend to have positive results through exchange and interaction. So you make friends. You learn that these folks are much the same as yourself, and that these differences that you see are really not so important. That the sort of human common ground really overwhelms any differences. So that's the kind of idea behind this relational distance. So relational distance is, spending a lot of time with people from another group, and so you develop close relations with them as opposed to distant relations. So that's what we mean by this relational distance. So what this hypothesis is saying here, this part of this theory of the social control perspective on genocide, is that the more that people live apart from each other and don't interact and don't develop ties, friendship, etc., greater chance of genocide. And there are many dimensions of relational distance, such as scope, frequency, and length of interaction between people, the age of their friendship, and the nature and number of links between them in a social network. Now, I don't know if I want to get too much in the weeds with all of these specifics. Sometimes, theories can get rather involved, and my purpose here is just to sort of introduce you in a general way to this understanding of genocide. But let me say here that what they're saying, this theory really, in a way, has sort of a quantitative approach. It's thinking about things in terms of closeness, distance, and different dimensions and all of that kind of thing. And so what they're saying here is that the degree that you're close to another group of people depends on how often, frequency of interaction with them, how long have you been interacting with people, making friends, associating with people, how long the age of your friendship, your relationship, does it go way back to all the way to when you were a child, or is it more recent? And the number of people that you have positive relationships with, and how strong, how positive are those relationships versus negative, that kind of thing. So they're just saying that there's a lot of different aspects that go into relational distance and whether it's considered to be close or not close. Ethnic groups whose members have less contact, lower rates of intermarriage, and have lived together for a shorter duration of time are more relationally distant. So that's just getting a little more specific about, okay, what do we mean when you're closer or further away? If you have two different ethnic groups and nobody ever from those two ethnic groups ever gets married together, low intermarriage rates, in other words, that's a sign that these two groups are not close, that they don't have close relational distance. If they don't socialize much, they don't get together and have dinner very often or attend each other's parties or social events, if they don't attend religious services together, they're segregated in many ways, the workplace, then they're going to be more relationally distant. If they haven't known each other for very long, they're going to be more relationally distant. So there's different dimensions to this. A large, rapid in-migration of immigrants or refugees can raise the risk of genocide. So again, on the perpetrators of genocide, they perceive a risk, they perceive a threat, and so people are more likely to be threatened, perceive a threat, if you see sudden change where maybe before this minority group was very small and not very visible, but due to sort of mass numbers of immigration, or let's say in an extreme example, you had thousands, tens of thousands of refugees pour into your country, and they're minority refugees who belong to the minority group in your country, then that minority group goes from being, small to all of a sudden now they're significantly, very noticeably, dramatically larger. The presence is much more visible, and that can lead to perceptions of a threat on the part of the majority of the government. So rapid social change, rapid movement of people into a territory, migration, whether it's kind of voluntary, just normal immigration sort of thing, or refugee status, that sort of thing. Just a dramatic increase in population can threaten the other group. Some examples of this, yes, Rwanda is a good example of this. Just before the 1994 genocide in Rwanda, 200,000 Hutu refugees poured into the country to avoid, and I'm missing a word there, to avoid conflict or war, trouble in Burundi, a neighboring country. So you get just a large number. All of a sudden, you get 200,000 new Hutus in Rwanda. And Hutus are like this minority population. And all of a sudden, 200,000 new folks right in there. So that causes a perception of a threat. Eastern European Jews moved in large numbers into German and Austrian cities before the Holocaust. So you had Jewish people for economic opportunities and other opportunities moving in large numbers into German cities, Austrian cities, like, for example, Vienna. And it, again, the majority population, Germans, notice this and perceive this as being a threatening sort of thing. So history shows that you get these rapid increases in population, and it can heighten the threat that people feel. Again, we don't want to justify the people's perceptions. We're only trying to understand what's in their minds, and what happens is they perceive a threat and react to that. So the focus here is not on the objective situation, what's actually going on, but what's in the minds of the perpetrators. Intermarriage, we mentioned that before. Let's stress that this is a really important one, and it's a clear. I like it because it's a very clear, concrete thing we can focus on. Intermarriage is another indicator of relational closeness, and it is accordingly a factor in protecting against suicide. I'm sorry, not suicide, genocide. That intermarriage is a sign that people from two different groups are not only are comfortable enough with each other to not only associate, to be friendly, to work side by side, to socialize at some casual level, but to do something which is involves an extreme closeness, getting married and deciding to join your lives together, permanently. So it's a sign of a definite positive sign that two groups are coming together. Now, this is, I think, a good example of what we're talking about here. There were fewer killings in fascist Italy than Nazi Germany because intermarriage was much higher in Italy. So you see here you have two fascist countries that are allies of each other, Italy and Nazi Germany in World War II. And yet the Germans were much more genocidal, much treated the Jewish people much worse than the Italians did, even though the Italians were fascists too. And one of the reasons, evidently looking at the historical records, one of the reasons for this was that a lot of Italians, Catholic Italians, Christian Italians, had married Jewish Italians. And because of these families coming together and because of intermarriage, this was sort of a sign, and it also helped integrate, reduce the relational distance between these two populations of people. So you can see that this can end up having important results if people are closer together and more comfortable and willing to intermarry. then you can see a lower chance that people resort to this really extreme thing of killing, entire groups of people. Functional interdependence refers to the extent to which individuals and groups cooperate with one another economically, politically, militarily, or otherwise. So another fancy term, functional interdependence, but on the ground, it's actually pretty simple to understand what they're talking about here. What they mean is, do you need this other group of people or not to do well in your own life? And so if you really need the other group of people, if they help make your life better, if your life depends on their activities, then there's going to be a less chance of genocide, because not only are you just doing a horrible thing, destroying other people, but you're also hurting yourself in some material, some important way. And people tend to worry about their own situations and are less likely to do something that's going to be harmful to their own situations. So that's what they mean by functional independence, and it can be in different ways. It can be the workplace, it can be in the marketplace, economically, it can be politically. We need folks politically, we need folks militarily. They're important in our military. A lot of soldiers come from this other group. We need these folks. They help us out, that kind of thing, or otherwise. Genocide is greater under conditions of functional independence, where groups do not depend on one another for their livelihood. So if this little group is isolated over here, and we don't have relations with them, and we don't benefit ourselves materially from what these folks are involved in, then we don't see any. Then the perception is that if these people weren't around anymore, it only would be good and it wouldn't be bad, because we don't depend on them for anything. We don't need them for anything. So people who are thinking the answer is to get rid of these people, they're not going to see this downside where it's going to hurt themselves. And that's, again, all of these concepts tend to be supported, at least to one extent or another, in the research, in the empirical data, looking at the history of this. For instance, in South Africa, under the apartheid regime, Africans, Indians, so citizens who were originally from India, and also what they called coloreds at the time. So these are like mixed folks, part white and part African. They made up the overwhelming majority of workers, and so the whites that ran the country, they needed these folks because these folks were most of the workers, most of the employees. If you had thoughts of genocide against this group, well, this is the vast majority of people, and people wouldn't want to eliminate their workers, their employees, the people they depend on to run their businesses, to run their organizations, etc. So again, when you have this functional interdependence, then you may have problems like you had in apartheid Africa, injustices and mistreatment, but not genocide. Ethnic relations were antagonistic and violent, but not genocidal in the case of South Africa. So we're not saying things are going to be good if you've got group conflict, but we're saying there's less likelihood of genocide if people need each other. Let's continue on to the next slide here. Other examples: when the French in colonial America were occupied with trading furs with the Native Americans and also preaching Christianity to them, the relations were more peaceful because, again, you had this positive exchange. You needed each other. We're benefiting from buying, trading furs with Native Americans, so it's good for business. And also this concern for natives that we want to share the Christian gospel with these folks, that kind of thing. So again, you see this connection. You see this feeling of folks needing each other. You tended to have more peaceful relationships between the French in colonial America and the Native Americans. What you saw genocide increase with less trading. So less exchange where I benefit and you benefit, well, then people are more likely to go extremely harsh and to get, to make that choice towards violence. Mexican landowners in California needed native labor. The gold-seeking immigrants did not and were more genocidal. So you have these Mexican landowners in California. They've got a lot of land that needs to be worked. And so they employ and work in a more positive, less violent way with the Native Americans. And so again, interdependence, your employees, I don't want to hurt my employees. But then in California, you have these immigrants coming from other states, other places, even around the world, flooding into California and hungry for gold. And the natives, to them, were strangers, and that they didn't have these beneficial, business relations, or they didn't see any need, any benefit from these natives. And so you saw immigrants who were just newcomers and were strangers to these natives were more likely to turn to genocidal strategies and to try to, kill bunches of people and that kind of thing. So another historical example of this interdependence we're talking about. Inequality of status is associated with unilateral violence of all kinds. Genocide is less likely to occur where ethnic groups are equal in size and also equal in power and resources, and where it does, it's less likely to be extreme. So again, this is an unfortunate dark side of human nature, but there is a tendency for humans to turn violent if they see themselves as powerful and they see the victims as very weak and vulnerable. If the victims are just as strong as the perpetrators might think twice about trying to be violent to wipe out the victims, because maybe the victims will fight back and overwhelm the perpetrators, and the perpetrators will be the ones who end up dying. So where you have an equal situation, the two groups are relatively equal. That's more of a situation like civil war or war of sorts, which is going to get nasty on both sides. And you see people are less likely to turn violent if they think that it's not going to work, if they think that the violence is going to turn back on them and they might lose and they might get wiped out. So you see genocide you're more likely to see it where there's huge, big power differentials. One big, powerful group that's large and powerful and has most of the resources, maybe the wealth, and controls the government. And on the one side, and then on the other side, you have a very small, weak group of people who don't have much power, don't have much resources, can't offer much resistance. It's a tragic, sort of terrible thing that in that situation, the powerful take advantage of the victim's weakness and will sometimes turn genocidal and violent because they see it as an easy win. So you see that, and you see that as I'm someone who studies crime, and I see that with crime too, that perpetrators, the criminals of all sorts, target the weak. They target the vulnerable. They don't go after equally matched people in an act of violence. No, because they might lose that. They go after the weakest and the most vulnerable because it's an easy win. So you see that with the genocide as well. Genocide is more likely to be downward than upward. I've already mentioned this before, so I don't need to belabor this point, but it tends to be the people who occupy the top levels of society becoming violent towards the people who are on the bottom of society. And it shouldn't be a surprise to you, but that's the general tendency. Now, there's exceptions to that because you sometimes have minorities who've been able to find their niche and be very successful within society. You see this in many Jewish populations around the world, small in terms of numbers, but able to occupy high levels within society, maybe to have impressive levels of wealth on average, that sort of thing. And so you do sometimes see kind of minorities who've done well. They have a little niche that they've been able to find within society to be successful. And the majority, the powerful folks, that they still go after this group because of resentment, and it's all the same kind of hatred and perceived grievance and conflict, all the stuff we've been talking about. So you do see these small minority groups that are quite successful being attacked, but more often is minorities who are completely without resources, without important positions within society, etc. So that's what we mean when we're talking downward versus upward. An example of this in Rwanda, the Tutsis were a smaller group than the Hutus and had been excluded from government and other positions of power. So that's the typical kind of situation, right? That's a typical kind of situation. Smaller, less powerful, less influential within society, more likely to be targets of genocide. Moving on to the next slide here. In many cases of genocide, it is perpetrated mainly by the state and its agents, so either state officials or people affiliated with the government who are committing the crimes, the violence against the victims. As states grow and become extensive, they tend to get more violent. Totalitarian regimes are the most violent and democratic regimes the least. So we tend to see who's most likely to commit genocide: a totalitarian, autocratic, top-down dictatorship. Nazis, Nazi Germany, World War II. You got one guy, Hitler, who's running the show from the top, and everybody does exactly what he says. He's a dictator. That kind of society is most likely to commit acts of genocide. Democratic, more just, fair societies where power is spread out and it's more representative forms of government and people have more of a voice in how the government's run, less likely to get acts of genocide. State power is expected to increase the likelihood and scale of violence. So again, this is a problem that you see with all different types of violence, is that the greater power tends to entice actors to act violently. If we have a lot of power, we have a lot of advantage over weaker groups, there's a temptation to take advantage of that and use the violence to even further dominate and punish and weaken the victim groups. Non-state genocides are similarly likely to occur downwardly and under conditions of great inequality. So it's the same thing. Even sometimes you'll see genocides that are not committed by the government, but just by powerful groups within society. But it's the same idea. It's all, the bottom line here is the powerful groups are the ones to commit acts of genocide against weaker groups, whether it involves the government directly or not. Okay, so that's an important, and it's common sense if you think about it. Power is, you're going to have power to be able to commit these acts, horrible acts against the victim population, because the victims are going to resist and fight back if they can. And this genocide tends to happen when the weak side is not able to offer much resistance. Genocide occurred more frequently in Australia than with other Aborigines, as they tended to be simpler societies. They were spread out, small in number, and not united. So, a hunter-gatherer or Aboriginal society, they tend, and this is true throughout history, that those folks, those types of societies, are not able to resist the more powerful societies that might be agriculturally based, if you're looking at back through the sweep of history, or industrial societies. Those societies have much greater numbers of people, they have greater resources and technology, and they're able to dominate these societies that have smaller numbers of people that are based on hunting, gathering, and these more ancient forms of social organization. So often the victims of genocide have been hunter-gatherers, more tribal societies, smaller societies. They get dominated by the bigger societies. The frequent attacks in California were usually against simple hunter-gatherer societies. So here you had Europeans who had these societies based on agriculture and that were moving towards industrialization. So they had resources and technological power and technological advantages that they use these superior forms of power to victimize, commit genocide against these small societies that didn't have the numbers or the organization or the technology to be able to effectively fight back. Okay, so this social control theory of genocide is an example of quote, pure sociology. So what they mean by this is you see this tradition in sociology of this this social control approach. It focuses solely on what we call structural characteristics and not the psychological characteristics of participants. So this is really very much a sociological approach to genocide, meaning we're not trying to get into the psychologies, the attitudes, the values, that aspect of why people commit genocide. Instead, we look at the social arrangements, like some of these factors we've been talking about: relational distance, issues of inequality of power, cultural distance, et cetera, issues of mobility, that kind of thing. So these are that's what they mean when they talk about structural characteristics. They're just talking about how society is organized, how people are organized together, and how that can influence the chance, the risk that genocide happens or not. So there's, this class is limited and we can't cover every perspective. We could have a different emphasis if we were to focus on what are the psychologies, what are the values, the attitudes that people who commit genocide have. And so we're not going to go there because we're limited on time, and I wanted to choose a sociological approach because since this is a sociological course. But you can see that, just to step back for a second, that's the sociology tends to take this what's called structural approach, where we look at how society is organized, how different groups of people, institutions are organized, and how those forms of organization can influence behavior, influence what happens. And so it's a contrasting, complementary approach to, say, what you might get in other disciplines. The focus here is on comparing sociology with psychology. So in every discipline, we're not saying that sociology is the best way or anything like that. Every discipline brings something to the table, and this is just one approach, but just be aware that there's other ways of looking at this. But finally, to wrap up this lecture, we can ask ourselves, okay, if this theory has some validity to it, what does it say about reducing these terrible acts of genocide? What does it have to say? Well, what this theory would say is that you need to do things like get people to interact more with each other and develop to narrow that relational distance, for example. Get people to arrange things so that people are socializing, interacting, getting to know each other, building ties and friendships more. Arrange things so that people need each other, so that people do business with each other, that people offer services to each other, so that we become interdependent and need each other, and then we tend to have more positive relationships. We need to reduce levels of inequality, so you don't have a group of people that's culturally distinctive, lacking in resources, very much without power, compared to the majority group, which has all of the sort of advantages in numbers and resources and power and that sort of thing, because that's a bad place to be. That's an unstable place to be, where all the power is over here and none of it's over there, kind of a thing. So see, this is what you'd want to do, is reduce all of these things that this theory says contribute to genocide. You would want to try to work on reforming society so you're reducing those factors that contribute to genocide. So now you could, I'll introduce later a documentary that I would like you to watch and to analyze. But what I hope that you do in this course, when you do analyze a case study of some sort of elite deviance, is to develop your own explanation. How do you see the elite deviance? What caused it to happen? What are the key factors that were behind this terrible crime that you're watching in some video documentary? How do we explain that? And once we come up with a good explanation, well, then based on that explanation, what are the solutions? What are the policy recommendations that you would put forward to try to reduce this problem, this form of elite deviance, which does so much harm to people? So I want that to be a central theme in this course, is for you to actively be thinking What are the facts? And what do the facts lead us to conclude about, number one, explaining the elite deviance, and number two, reducing, preventing, stopping the elite deviance? So anyway, I'll leave it there, and we'll talk later.